Cutting her teeth at the New York Post before gaining national prominence at Politico, Maggie Haberman is now the most consistent and prolific political reporter for the New York Times. Haberman's reporting consistently makes the front page, and she has covered Donald Trump since her time as a reporter at the Post. Haberman's ability to be reporting seemingly 24/7 while maintaining her obligations as a mother makes her not only a remarkable human being, but a role model for aspiring female reporters everywhere. Her obligation is always to her piece rather than any external interests, and she scoops her rivals far more often than they scoop her. When push comes to shove, editors want Haberman in their corner rather than on the opposition's. And now, in our corner, we have Maggie and Clyde.
Big and little.
I'm the taller one. So, a few years ago, while I still had my column at the Times, the youngest of my three children, Emma, took a job at the Center for Architecture. And in the job interviews leading up to it, the final one was, predictably enough, with the director, who at the end of it said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" "Yes," Emma said. "I can't help but remark on your last name. You're not by any chance related to Maggie Haberman, are you?" True story. It has the unfortunate benefit of being true. Briefly, if I could just say about my three children, that Maggie, you know, Zach, the middle child, is in charge of digital news at the Daily News, and Emma is now at the New School, where she's an events manager. She's the only one who didn't go into journalism. She's what's known in our family as the smart one. Bernie's introduction of Maggie was quite on and wonderful. But let me read two opinions. I should add, by the way, that not only at the New York Post, she also worked at the Daily News. She's now worked for all three major New York City newspapers. There was this view of her from the Poynter Institute, which most of you will know is a journalism institute and has nothing to do with the Singing Sisters, which said of, they named Maggie among the top 5 political reporters who work in print for this past year. I believe you were number 2. I don't know how David Farrenhold beat you out, but there you go. Among the many things they said was, "It's not uncommon to come across a detail in one of Haberman's stories about Trump or Clinton and wonder to yourself how she managed to pry it loose from a campaign staffer." Then there was this view of Maggie, third-rate reporter. That was from Donald Trump. I will leave it to you to decide which one of these deserves the greater weight. No question which does. Let me start with a easy question. You've covered both Donald Trump for a long time and Hillary Clinton, maybe even longer, both at the Times and even more so at Politico. Can you just give this room full of journalists a sense of what it was like covering each of them in terms of accessibility, in terms of reliability, in terms of lies, in terms of the pluses and the minuses?
Sure, and thank you all for being here. And Bernie, thank you for that very lovely introduction. This has been an unusual... Sorry, I was just thanking people. And this has been a bit of a different year than I think many of us had expected it to be. Certainly me. So yes, I covered Hillary Clinton's Senate race here in 2000, and I've covered Trump on and off. Being at the tabloids, you covered Trump. So now being at anything, you cover Trump. So last year, I go back to the starting point of the campaigns, and for me, this is sort of an important demarcation point. So Hillary Clinton began her campaign with this email issue hanging over her head. She did this now pretty famous press conference in front of the Guernica at the United Nations building, which was an odd visual choice,
but prophetic, as it turned out.
It was appropriate. And with sort of a lot of questions about whether she would have a reset with the media. She had a terrible relationship with the press in 2008. She has had a terrible relationship with the national press throughout her national career. And I'm sorry, I'm trying very hard to turn. I apologize. I'm not used to standing like this. But so the big focus was, how much time will she get? And her team was very self-conscious of it, or at least trying to create the appearance of, we're going to be more open, we're going to do this differently than 2008. In reality, it wasn't much different than 2008. And in fact, I would argue she was more accessible in 2008. She would frequently come back and visit with the reporters on her plane. She did pretty frequent press briefings. It was just a very different time. But she was very, very hard to get access to. I think she never sat down for a real New York Times interview throughout this campaign, which I think is pretty unheard of for a major party nominee. Trump, on the other hand, I've had his cell phone number throughout the last year and a half. He still answers it, P.S., which is its own thing. But so Trump was very smart. He's a master manipulator of the press, and he was very, very smart about making himself available, despite the fact that it's not as if he was answering most of the questions we would ask him particularly honestly, despite the fact that much of it was done as, sort of either a game or to achieve an end. He was very reachable, and that helped him, I think, enormously as he was entering this national realm. I watched him in 2011 when he thought about running for president, and I covered it at Politico. And he ended up calling it all off right in the middle, coincidentally, I'm sure, of Sweeps Week for The Apprentice. But he was trying, John Avlon, the editor of the Daily Beast, made a comment to me at the time that was absolutely true, that Trump was trying to apply New York City tabloid rules to the national press. And it wasn't working at that point. At that point, he showed up at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. Obama mocked him. He was clearly seething with anger, despite the fact that he continues to say through a sort of stapled smile, I loved it. But this time, he did succeed in doing it. He recognizes that he sees himself as a commodity. And so he would set the terms of agreement and engagement, and he got all of particularly the national television, to agree to it. So, Chuck Todd, if you're not going to allow me to call in by phone to meet the press, then, George Stephanopoulos will. And he got everyone to play by his own rules. Now, I don't think that actually is transparency, but in terms of accessibility to him, he was much more accessible. In terms of lies, Trump tells a falsehood. It isn't even with regularity. It's like in 10-minute increments. I mean, he really it's and they're not all the same. But I wrote a piece last year about his untruths and salesman-like stretches, and it sort of all got worse in the fall. But Hillary Clinton also was not what I would say honest about her email server when she took questions at a very short press conference back in March of 2015, and I think that set the tone.
But any falsehoods by her struck me as within normal, recognizable boundaries of politicians that we've all covered. Dealing with the fact that he lies, sort of a two-part question here. One, do you think he's really aware sometimes that he's lying, or is there a mental issue here? I'm not saying it for a laugh. I really wonder if this guy's all there, frankly. But the other one is the journalism question, which is what we're doing here. Somewhere along the line, it became clear that the Times was going to call his falsehoods for what they were in the piece, instead of the more traditional politician says something that's dubious, you go to the other camp and you have the other camp say he's a liar. Where I first became aware of it, and it probably happened before, but where I first really noticed it was that Ashley Parker had a piece on Trump speaking before the NRA, and there were maybe 4 paragraphs on the page 1 leg of the piece, and in 3 paragraphs of those 4, she had some form of he said falsely, or he said incorrectly, or he said deceptively in some way or another, and he said Hillary Clinton wants to do away with the Second Amendment. No, Ashley said on her own. She never did say that. Was there a conscious decision, if you can maybe walk us through the process, if it's not revealing too many in-house secrets, of how, it was clearly somebody had to decide we're going to call him out on these things each and every time.
It's a great question, and I think it's not one that has a resolution to date as we get ready for his inauguration, because he still says things that are not true. If you read his Twitter feed, according to him, he won by a historic landslide, and it was neither historic nor a landslide. And in fact, he lost the popular vote historically. That is actually the only thing. There were several meetings last year. I would say there are a couple of answers. One is that I think that, if I'm being candid, I think the Times was late to covering Trump, and I don't think I'm giving away a state secret there. I think that there was a belief that he was going to flame out. I think there was a legitimate belief, based on our reporting, that he was probably not going to stay in the race. And I know from my own reporting that he had this whole elaborate plan, if he didn't do well, of how he was going to essentially walk off the stage, saying that the party wasn't accepting enough in October. But he continued to do well, and that didn't happen. So the moment there are different things that he does. There's the falsehoods that he says, and then there's the sort of gaslighting he does of opponents or critics. And so my experience, I've told this story a lot, but for me it was a pretty seminal moment. Last November, he left open the possibility of a Muslim registry. It was, I think, right after the Paris attacks. And something sort of changed in him after Paris. And he became much more militant. But he left this open. He refused to clarify it on the record. His aides refused to clarify it. And we did an A1 story, and I think appropriately. It was a pretty un-American statement to be open to a religious registry. And all we did was just report what he said. We gave them every opportunity. And one of his campaign officials had Breitbart write a piece about me, and it was a really sexist, negative, savage piece that Trump himself tweeted out twice, as it's so nice when the media polices other media. And so as journalists, I have not encountered that before in United States politics, of a major official being able to use this kind of platform and being willing to use it in such a personal and distortive way. So some of it for us was, I think, wading through that. The second part was that, to your point, there are so many things he says that are either exaggerations or just outright not true, or distortions of an opponent's view, usually Hillary Clinton, but not only, because it happened in the Republican primary too, that we had a lot of meetings about what we should do about this. Lie is a very freighted word that implies motive, and so I think there was a reluctance to use that word.
Is falsehood somow seen as different?
No, falsehood is seen as different, actually, because falsehood it is not true, but a lie has a motive behind it. And so as it was clear he was going to become the nominee, but we're talking about May of this year, I think that you saw in the Times an increase in sort of truth squatting him, for lack of a better way of putting it. And the moment that the tipping point was when he did the birther press conference. Because I think there was a feeling, we put the word lie on the front page. There was a feeling that if you're not going to describe...
I'm sorry, this was the one where he said that actually Hillary Clinton created it back in 2008?
Well, he said two things. He said that actually, I accept now that President Obama was born here, but Hillary started it. So there were actually two. And they're not of equal weight, right? But if you're not going to call questioning the legitimacy of the President of the United States a lie, and more than questioning it, claiming he's not legitimate, then I don't know when else you would use the word. It was a controversial call. I think it was absolutely the right call by the paper. But we are not doing it every single time he says something that is untrue. I have inserted the word lie a few times into my copy about something he has said, and I've had it changed to falsehood on the desk. And I think we are still struggling with this. But we have never had. The Washington Post is set up some Google tracker or some web tracker where you can fact check Trump's tweets yourself. I think we have some similar thing in the works, or some type of project in the works. But how you fact check somebody who doesn't agree to a common set of facts is is very, very difficult.
Do you think that this will change once he's actually sworn in as president? There is an institutional desire that over many years I've certainly detected of a certain deference to the president, no matter who he's been. And but do you think that this will go on? He stated without any substantiation that Germany is a province of France or something like that.
Did I just miss that in the last hour? No, that will definitely continue. That will definitely continue, and there have been conversations about it that we need to aggressively and rigorously cover him. We need to aggressively and rigorously tell our readers what is true and what is not true. And in fact, the stakes are higher, much higher. They were quite high during the campaign, and it is unfortunate that people had already formed an opinion about him, and it became very hard to shake them off of it with facts.
Covering his tweets, it's endless, which probably means that you don't get a ton of sleep because he seems to tweet at 4 a.m. sometimes. Again, is there you can't have a real policy, I guess, but how do you decide what you're going to do about this? I know that you and your colleagues were criticized by some people, for example, for focusing on his tweet about how flag burners ought to lose their citizenship and be jailed. And the criticism was along the lines of, you're allowing yourself to be distracted by these meaningless, meanderings on his part when indeed there are serious conflicts of interest and he hasn't sold his business and we haven't seen his tax returns and probably never will. My sense was that in fact that this is the Trump id that needs to be covered, and that it's not purely a deflective, a Ricky J. Illusionist thing. Watch over here because all the action's going on over here. So I'm curious what your sense is about it, and what do we do? Clearly, I mean, to me, if a guy says he wants to imprison people for expressing their First Amendment rights, and he's going to be the president, to me that's called news. On the other hand, attacking Alec Baldwin one more time may not be news, although there it was on the front page of today's art section. So how do we cover the tweeter, the twit who tweets?
I don't. Declining to comment on your opinion of the incoming president.
That is purely my opinion,
not mine.
Not Maggie's.
But I do share your view of what constitutes news, and what doesn't. Right. So his 800th tweet this morning about you people are not giving me enough credit for my massive electoral college win and my savvy at going to Michigan. No, we don't need to cover this. But him suggesting something such as imprisoning people for flag burning and stripping them of citizenship.
Right.
I don't understand why that's a lot of people put a lot of stock in this idea, to your point, that everything is some part of some grand plan. And I've covered this guy a really long time, folks. It isn't. So, it's and with a lot of these, it's sort of like, yes, he's distracting you from his burning leg by lighting his nose on fire. I mean, these are not wins for him. So I think that we have an obligation to take the things he tweets about that are serious matters, that are important to citizens, and suggest areas of governance. I think the flag burning would be one. We absolutely will keep covering them, and we should. I think that it's not a binary, and I understand. The problem with him is there is so much to cover. And one of the tricks that he did deploy during the primary, this one was a plan, was he would throw so much chum out there, and everybody would chase it, 5 different things, and not a single thing would really take hold as a news story. And they knew what they were doing, because I would talk to his advisors about it. Now this isn't chum. This is, here's my massive conflict of interest. Here's my son's, selling off a charity for access. Here's my national security advisor who recently met with members of a right-wing party from Austria. Here's, and so this isn't deliberate, but there is an enormous amount to cover with him. And so I think figuring out what the priorities are is going to be a challenge for every newsroom, certainly ours. But I do think we've done a pretty good job so far of focusing on both. We have my colleague Eric Lipton, who is remarkable, was at City Hall for the Times when I was there for the Post and the Daily News, has done amazing work about the conflicts of interest.
How much of abuse, personal abuse, have you had to put up with, both from him, but even more so from his supporters? A lot of people may not realize the nature of the attacks. I'm not revealing a family secret, although it still pisses me off no end, that you've gotten letters home a day or two after the election, if I remember right. There was this 3-page anti-Semitic screed that came your way. You had at least one postcard that was more innocuous, but still it went to your home. And so they know where you live. More importantly, they know where my grandchildren live. No, teasing. Joke.
Speaking of coverage priorities, thank you.
Joke. We'll talk about, that's another matter. No, seriously, I mean, how much, but not just from his supporters, but from him, how much of it was, frankly, anti-Semitic? How much of it was more misogynist? And am I wrong in assuming that he seems to have a thing about female reporters? It seems to me that the people who he singled out by name as being terrible people were folks like you, Katie Tur of NBC, Gail Collins, Maureen Dowd, a few others. I never heard a male name in any of these things. Now, maybe I missed them on occasion, but it does seem to me that there's, as Mr. Trump would say in various other contexts, there's something going on.
He did call Chuck Todd Sleepy Eyes Chuck for a very long time, which I think Chuck did not particularly enjoy. And he has occasionally had a tough word for a male anchor or a male reporter, but I would agree that if you just look at the numbers, most of them are women, and it's often with the descriptor neurotic, crazy. That's how he described Mika Brzezinski from Morning Joe a couple of times. He described Maureen Dowd that way at one point. Maureen Dowd, who, only months earlier, according to him, was one of the best. And you can sort of change in his estimation depending on the hour. I don't know how much of it is because I'm a woman. I can't get into his heart or his head in that way. But it certainly whipped up among his supporters a tremendous amount of misogynistic savagery. And then the sub-level of that was anti-Semitism. I actually got a lot fewer by way of anti-Semitic attacks than some of my colleagues did, particularly on Twitter. Men actually seemed to come in for more of that than I did. But yes, we got this letter home. We actually had an unlisted address. Some supporter of Trump's on a white supremacist site did what's called doxing, which is revealing private information about people, of something like 50 journalists. I was one of them. And we all got this form letter of anti-Semitism. There was basically the same thing, went to everybody. But yes, and I have small children, and I have an 11-year-old who's very inquisitive and very aware, and who felt very traumatized by this election. Because the thing I think Trump doesn't think about is, how an 11-year-old feels when his parent is being attacked. So it was a lot. I mean, look, I didn't use the word gaslighting lightly, right? I mean, I think one of Trump's approaches is he makes you question your read on things. He's very good at trying to make people wonder if they're seeing things the right way. And it is going to take a lot of resolve on the part of all of the press to push against that when he's the president.
Let me turn to the emails that we reported on, although usually inside, but everybody did. I don't mean the Hillary Clinton State Department emails, but the Democratic National Committee emails, John Podesta's, and so on. I'm increasingly of a view, which is probably a minority view in the Times newsroom, if I had to guess, that this is almost no different than if somebody had hacked into a old-fashioned metal mailbox, found a bunch of letters, and went around town waving, looky what I found. Look what John Podesta said to Hillary Clinton, or the other way around. This is not government documents, after all. somebody threw the Pentagon Papers at me as a response, and I didn't agree with that because I think they're qualitatively different. But are we not trafficking in stolen goods when we run this?
Well, we unquestionably are, although, again...
Should we be, and where are the ethical lines to be drawn?
So, I mean, a few things I would say, just for your point of comparison on that. I don't know how qualitatively different it is than, say, us running Trump's tax returns, which he clearly had not signed off on giving us. But they were unquestionably within the public interest. We got them from a source. So that to me is the analog, or more of one.
But I'm going to assume that we got, and I really don't know, that we got them from a source whose actions would not put him or her or us in jail.
Right. I don't know the answer to that, but and it's a fair point. In terms of the emails, I think that every newsroom in the country needed to have more of a thoughtful conversation about what the standard for news was on these, because the vast majority of them were campaign context and pretty routine campaign context, with the added flip of a lot of Hillary Clinton's aides don't particularly like or trust her, and that was, or think her judgment is strange. But if you've been a reporter covering her for a long time, you know that. And if you've been a reporter covering her for a long time, you've written that, which most of us have. So the danger with WikiLeaks, among all of the other things that you just mentioned, and I agree with you about they are stolen property, and a clear violation of privacy, is that if you repackage anything to look like it's new, it looks new. So for instance, would be this dinner that I and 30 other reporters attended at John Podesta's house, which was right after the campaign. It was an off-the-record dinner. I'm not violating anything. It's been reported on, and it was reported on at the time. But the list was in WikiLeaks, and it's since been described on a number of conservative websites as an example of quote-unquote collusion with the Clinton campaign. This is preposterous, with all due respect. It's no different than going to an off-the-record drinks hosted by a district attorney, or the Republican National Committee, which invited me to one a couple of weeks ago, or Donald Trump's OTR with reporters at Mar-a-Lago just a few days ago. And so, but if you reframe something as new, devoid of context, the internet is such that enough people will still believe it's new, and it won't really matter what you say or what the facts are. And that, to me, frankly, is the scariest challenge we all face. I do think there needed to be more of a conversation about what was news. That having been said, I think that the content of Hillary Clinton's paid speeches that were in there, I think, are hard to ignore,
Okay, that I might agree with.
Yeah, but that to me is the bar, right? I mean, something that's pretty revealing about the candidate. Most of it was gossip back and forth from different aides, and again, as I mentioned before, a pretty unusual and rare look at the way a campaign works. I mean, we spend a lot of time on my side of the aisle trying to figure out how campaigns function. This was a pretty clear look at how one did, and an unusual ability to take the hood off and look inside. But I agree with you that I think we should not assume that the Podesta hacks were a one-off, given what we know and given where cyber warfare seems to be headed, and given the state of global affairs right now. I do wonder if we are on the verge of seeing an unprecedented weaponization of private information.
Not to get you to talk ill of your bosses, because who needs that?
Thanks.
Anytime. Anytime. Got to keep the paycheck going. But a couple of days after the election, Arthur Sulzberger and Dean Baquet issued a statement that sounded to a lot of people like a mea culpa for the coverage. And I'll leave aside handling of polls for a second. I didn't see much culpa to be, beating breasts over. I thought that the anger that was out there had been covered a lot by the Times, either in full stories from places in Michigan or Western Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, but certainly, virtually every story there was a paragraph that talked about working class white anger. So, I mean, TV may have some atoning to do come, next confession or Yom Kippur or whatever. But I thought Times coverage, at the risk of sounding like an old company boy, was pretty tough.
I thought our coverage was pretty good, and I've spent a lot of time reflecting with alone and also with people I trust and with colleagues and with people we cover, just whose opinions I trust on what we could have done differently. I mean, that obviously can't speak to what their intentions were with that email, and it's become a bit of an ink blot as to who, according to Trump, we were apologizing for how we covered him, which is not true. But back to the earlier question. I think that email probably reflected some of the frustration about our predictive models on units like the Upshot, which...
I was going there next, yeah.
Well, I'll just touch on it slightly, but which had suggested, I think it was that Hillary Clinton at one point had a 95% chance of victory or something like that in our model. And so I think there's a legitimate question about whether we ought to be, whether data journalism should get out of what it objectively was supposed to be, which was not horse race, and that's exactly what that became. So I think that was an issue. If I could pick an area where I think we should have done more, there's really only one, which is I think we should have done more about Trump's conflicts of interest, his business conflicts. And that's not just us. I think everybody should have. To be clear, David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post did wonderful work about Trump's foundation, but Trump's foundation never claimed to be the Clinton Foundation. It never pretended to be something quite like that, which is a substantial global model. And there was a lot of sort of, from Clinton supporters, very angry emails and phone calls to us saying, why aren't you saying this about the Trump Foundation? Well, because not everything is exactly the same as everything else. And I think the Washington Post did very well on that one area, but also did not do coverage on sort of the larger question, which is his business. And I think it was pretty well established by the summer that Trump's foundation had a lot of problems. But beyond that, there's a lot more that could have been said about how dysfunctional Hillary Clinton's campaign was. But I don't think that's what people are wishing we had covered differently somehow.
No, probably not. I want to throw this, somebody's phone, I want to throw this to the crowd, but just very quickly, on this business of, she has a 95% chance. I think at the end, Nate Cohn was saying 84%. Is there, and that drove me crazy because as somebody who's lost more times than he cares to admit at the track, long shots lose. Obviously, are we going to drop that? See, I don't think the state-by-state polls were off that much, but or at all practically. They were within the margin of error, but for the most part. But can we get rid of this? Are we going to? More importantly, are we going to get rid of this? If this, oh yeah, it's 84%. The average reader understandably sees 84% and says it's a sure thing. I'm going to go off to the movies.
I don't know the answer to that. My hope is that it will be adjusted, not just with us, but with everybody who does that kind of predictive modeling. The one other thing that, just in terms of things I wish we had covered more, and I agree with you that I think we did plenty on how much economic anxiety there was and anger there was across the country, and certainly in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt. What I think we missed, and I think everybody missed, and certainly Democrats missed, is how, I hate this word, and you will hate this word, branded Trump was. Right, exactly. But the number of people I would talk to in Iowa and New Hampshire who described Trump as like an Edison-type entrepreneur and innovator because they knew him from The Apprentice, because they saw him in their living rooms for 10 years at the big conference room in a leather-backed chair firing people. So when we would write stories explaining that actually he's kind of indecisive and he kind of doesn't ever really fire anybody, they didn't really accept it because he was the "you're fired" guy. And so they knew him on their own in their minds. And whatever information we presented to them ran contrary to that and was just evidence that we were trying to tear him down.
All right.
On that happy note.
There's going to be a microphone going around, and there are going to be a lot of questions, I imagine, so some folks are going to be disappointed. But my eye caught here first, so we've got, please, could we keep the questions? I'm very good. I've done some of these things before. I'm very good at getting, the axe if it turns
It's
into
not the hook. I hope it's not the axe.
It's not a. If it turns into no, it's an axe. If it turns into the peroration. So here we go.
Mine, I hope, will be a short enough question, and it's to your last point. Despite how wonderful media coverage was, if not perfect, and probably not perfect, but wonderful, strong, thorough, and despite historic first endorsements from a record number of newspapers, what do your colleagues make of the fact that maybe the media's influence or ability to educate audiences was declining?
I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, I think that we have all been aware, if we're paying attention, that our influence is declining for a while. I mean, and I'll give you for instance, and I'm very blessed to work at this paper. But at one point, 20 years ago, the endorsement by the New York Times editorial page in a Democratic primary basically was predictive of the winner. That stopped being the case in 2001 with Ellen Hevesy. And so I think that we have seen just sort of an erosion of the impact across the board of media. Now that media is so disparate and people get their news in a lot of different ways. I do think that there was a sense of, I think that in the first week after Trump's election, there was a tremendous amount of grappling with what this actually meant about us. And I don't think we know yet. I do think that it's going to be important for the media writ large to hear the criticisms of what we did, which doesn't mean that every criticism of what we did is correct, because I don't think they are. But I do think that, I mean, some of them are coming from people who are very frustrated by the outcome. And I don't quite know what Clinton supporters seem to think that the Times should have, stopped Trump. That's not our role. We're not here to run a campaign against Donald Trump. But I do think it is important for us to realize how most of the rest of the country sees us as journalists. And our credibility has taken a hit, I think. I don't mean not the Times. Journalism as a profession has taken a hit over several years. And I think it might take a little while for that to change.
Hey, Maggie.
Ralph Blumenthal, my first editor at CC.
I'm not to blame. I'm interested in why you think that more aggressive reporting might have changed things when so much was thrown at Trump and it didn't stick. And are we not in some kind of post-factual paradigm now where facts don't matter anymore, and it's the kind of aura that he projects, and he's completely immune to whatever comes out, even if his tax returns would come out or any other thing, short of perhaps collusion with the Russians?
I mean, I don't think we know yet whether we are in a totally post-fact world, because I suspect that what will happen with this president is the same as what happens with most presidents, which is that if people perceive they are doing better, and if the economy stays decent, then he will do okay because people won't be angry. If it doesn't, then people will get very upset, and I think we will learn a lot from whatever the first controversy of his administration is. He's still coming in with record disapproval. I mean, that's not nothing, and that's hard to sustain when you get there. In terms of whether it would have impacted the outcome, I don't know. I just think that the question of his business is not just, it's literally what he ran on. He ran as, I am a successful businessman and I'm going to, and I quote, drain the swamp. And today his first campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, just announced that he's opening a lobbying firm in Washington just down the street from the White House. That's in the press release. That's really reading the inside part outside. So I don't know that it would have changed the outcome. I do agree that not a lot stuck to him, in part because of what I said about how people already viewed him and thought that they knew him, in part because he would just throw so much out that it was hard to grab onto anything, and in part because most people didn't think he'd win. I mean, it is still important to remember that he was still only polling at about 35% of the Republican primary in April. That's not a mandate. I don't know what it will mean for the future in terms of facts, but it is why it is going to be important, I think, for the media at large to not just be vigilant in fact-checking, but also to stand sort of unified. He's very good at picking off individual people.
Question?
According to a relatively new poll, almost half of the people who voted for Trump say that that it should be easier for political candidates and office holders to sue the press for articles that are unfavorable or inaccurate? How much of a concern is that to you?
One story that I think didn't get anywhere near enough coverage, and I think some of it is because in our profession we are generally taught not to turn the camera on ourselves or the pen on ourselves, was about him saying that he wanted to open up the libel laws during the campaign, despite the fact that that doesn't mean what he thinks it means. It suggested a tremendous disregard for a free and independent press, which, again, was clear that he has had, but it was a breathtaking statement, and he and his advisors will gleefully say that they have public opinion on their side, even though they helped form that public opinion. One of the main tenets of our democracy that makes us different, as you all know, than other countries is our media and its freedom. And yes, I am very concerned about what this means.
Isn't the larger issue, or a very large issue, the Electoral College and what we're going to do with that and how the press covers that issue, since she did win the popular vote?
I mean, I think that, again, is another issue where I don't think that it's the press's job to crusade against the Electoral College. The Electoral College has been in place for a very long time, obviously. But whether there is going to be something... Right now, I think that there is an enormous amount of venting going on from Clinton supporters and for Trump dislikers, even if they don't like Clinton. And the Electoral College issue has now become the latest one, but it's going to take an enormous heave of the will for anybody to actually move anything on that. Again, I don't think that that's the media's role. I do think it is important, however, for people to not fall for the argument of, if it weren't for California or New York, Trump would have won. Last I checked, that California and New York were both part of the union.
To what extent do you think misogyny played a role among Democrats who either stayed home or voted for independence?
It's a great question. I know that Clinton's advisors attribute a fair amount to it. I've heard a lot of that since the election. I don't know how to pick, and I'm sure that is a significant factor. I don't know how to quantify that factor. I also don't know how to separate that away from a number of very self-defeating mistakes that she made. I don't know of another, I mean, whatever people think of the Comey letter, which was clearly extraordinary in the final week of the campaign, and whatever people think of how it was covered, none of this exists without a private server. And at a certain point, that I think became an issue she was never able to escape from. And as we learned from WikiLeaks, not to talk about gossip and these stolen emails, but her aides were even less aware of it, most of them, than I had realized. And I knew that very few people knew about it at the time, but she was not forthcoming about it because she keeps a very close circle. Her paid speeches in 2013. I mean, I will tell you, I had a number of Democratic strategists who I know remind me that I had said in 2013 that I didn't think she was running because I couldn't fathom that she was doing these paid speeches. I mean, in a year where we saw Bill de Blasio sweep from behind in this Democratic primary in New York City, where we saw the same resonance of income inequality in Illinois and elsewhere in the country, you know that this is a driving issue in the Democratic Party, and you're giving paid speeches to Goldman Sachs, 2 in 1 week. Again, to be clear, if you want to go do that, that's great, but you have to expect that some people are going to have problems with that. I think there were a lot of reasons why she lost. I do believe this was a perfect storm election, not dissimilar from what elected Mike Bloomberg in 2001.
It was very interesting what you said about access to Donald compared to access to Hillary. And do you anticipate that in his new administration, the game of access, if you will, for Washington reporters is going to change? And is the reporting community in Washington thinking that it should change?
There was this picture posted on Twitter of the embeds who are covering Trump, who are at Mar-a-Lago this weekend, posing with him, and about 30 of them. And it's not a great look. This was after this OTR. I've talked about it with a bunch of people. You know, is it any different than the White House Christmas party where I just took my daughter? There's a picture of us on Flickr. Yes, because it's not the president's own home, among other things, because it's not a group shot, because it wasn't an OTR. It creates an appearance of coziness. And one of the things that Trump has done very well, and he has done this over and over again with different industries and different groups of people, is he has a knack, and I'm not saying it's quite true here, but he does have a knack of proving that people are exactly who he said they were. So watching all of these Republican officials who were badly opposed to him now suddenly sucking up to him and running to Trump Tower to talk about his historic win. I mean, literally the same people who were condemning him as a threat to the Republic a few months ago. Those are, he would say, the typical politicians, and that's what he criticized. Others would say the White House press corps or the political press corps were as bad as everybody said we were because you're posing with Donald Trump. I think the press corps needs, and the issue for me with the picture was that President Obama, to my point about the White House Christmas party, is not, refusing to hold press conferences or, threatening to reopen libel laws. I don't know whether the reporters who were at that OTR talked to him about access and talked to him about how, concerns about this. That is what I would have done had I been there. But I do think that there needs to be a holistic discussion, and there are some. And the White House Correspondents Association has had conversations like this. I think that Washington is probably always going to have its own type of reporting. Going to go cover Washington was a very jarring experience for me. It was very, very different than New York, which is all about, especially at the tabloids, which is basically about punching people in the face with a 2x4. And in DC, they're sort of all together. I don't expect it will be like that, but I don't quite know yet what the difference will look like. And in terms of your question for me, I'm going to be covering Trump from here, which is unusual. And we are referring to Trump Tower as White House North. But my logic on this, and the paper I think feels the same, is that, he's not moving, so why would I? But I still have a lot of Trump contacts. I know a lot about him. I know him pretty well. And he will, I think, be here, at least 3 days a week. So that you really don't. I mean, look, Washington will still be the center of gravity. Heads of state are still going to want to come to the White House. They're not really going to want to come to Trump Tower. But he's been very good at making people play by his rules. For instance, the transition is basically bifurcated. DC makes recommendations. They send them to New York. New York undoes them. Reince Priebus has been trying to get Trump to move the transition down to Washington for 3 weeks now, and he won't do it. So I suspect we will see more of this resistance.
So in terms of the conflicts of interest, is there a realistic possibility of impeachment?
He's not president yet. I mean, let's...
Okay, I'll wait.
It's never too early.
Ask me in a year.
I was curious, in your career covering him from the tabloid 2x4s to the austere avenues and corridors of the Times, has Trump ever said, appealed to you in some way that this is the quintessential Trump that I nailed in my prose, or is he so elusive when it comes to fact-changing, truth-shifting, will-o'-the-wisp that it's hard to pin down, and we're just going to have to go with it? And as journalists, should we be scared because we're the enemy in his eyes, and are we going to be arrested?
It's a really excellent question. I did a briefing with a colleague who has since, to my great sadness, left the paper, Ashley Parker, for the Washington bureau right after Trump won, and Ashley went to the Washington Post. But we did a briefing for our DC bureau and about who he is and about what we know of him, and I think it was pretty jarring for people because what snippets you get from reading the coverage is a little different. I think I have a pretty good sense of him, and I think my coverage has reflected him pretty well. But he's not consistent. I mean, it's not, and I don't mean he's not consistent in positions. He's not consistent. I had a conversation with him once. I forget even what I had called him about, but he was in a mood, and I asked him a question. I think it was about the NRA, and he answered, And then I said it'd be good to get together with you when you're back in New York. And he started yelling at me about some indignation from 2 weeks ago. I was really like, I sort of couldn't keep up with the plot. Sometimes loyalty is a premium for him, except for when it isn't. He is, his family's word is the final word, except for when it isn't. He's very understanding when he's told something until he decides he doesn't care and wants to discard it. So your question is a really good one, and I don't have a great answer.
Maggie, your father asked you a two-part question earlier, and you only answered one of the parts. The one
Damn journalists.
The one you didn't answer was when he said, does Trump really believe the lies he says? And then I have a follow-up.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're going to hold me to that. Some of them, yes. Some of them, no. Some of the things that he says, I believe. Look, I don't live in his head and I don't live in his heart, but my impression from covering him is that some of the things he says he has absolutely convinced himself of. Other times he knows he is saying something that is not true to get out of whatever thing he's in the middle of. When he believes in his heart that anybody who criticizes him is by definition a bad person. So whatever he says about them in his mind becomes a fact. In terms of policy, he says what he heard somewhere, what he heard on TV. He doesn't read books, he doesn't really read the paper, he doesn't use the internet. I still don't really know how some of the tweets get sent to him, but I believe his social media staff sends him some of them. He doesn't, literally the computer in his office doesn't get used. So a lot of this is based on gut and feeling. And sometimes he knows and sometimes he doesn't.
Well, Maggie, the thing that scares many of us is how he will react in a national security crisis. And based on what you just said, what's your feeling about that?
I think a lot of it is going to depend on who's around him at that moment. I think that I think that the big question mark of his administration is Mike Flynn, his national security advisor, who came under an enormous amount of criticism under the Obama administration. I think that in the foreign policy community, I've actually heard, other than the concerns about his relationship with Putin when he was at Exxon, Rex Tillerson has struck a lot of people as a potential good sign. Mattis has become a source of encouragement for a lot of people. And a lot of this is going to be who he's surrounded by and who has his ear last. That's a big thing with him.
It really is something, though, when the person you're taking great hope in is nicknamed Mad Dog, but that's another issue.
He hates that nickname, though.
Maggie, we've heard you talk, and we've heard and read a lot about how the media in general missed at least the depth and breadth of the anger on the economic front, the white working class voters. Do you think the press, the media also missed a scary level of racial division, of what we might call white power entitlement? I've heard references to this, and best summed up in the phrase that perhaps Trump's campaign slogan also meant "Make America White Again." Did the press miss some of that, all of that, much of that?
I think some press may have missed some of it. My colleague Alex Burns, who I was at Politico with and am now at the Times with, did an exceptional story when Trump got into the race last July or June about Trump's history of race baiting in this city, going all the way back to the Central Park jogger case, where he took out a full-page ad saying "Bring back the death penalty," to him sort of sliming Native Americans during a gaming fight. So I think that people who knew Trump well, the five borough view of Trump is very different than the rest of the country, which is, I think, part of the problem. But I don't actually think that people missed it in terms of the racial overtones or undertones. I think that people weren't quite certain what weight to give it in coverage, because there were some people who had a lot of economic anxiety who were not racist, and we know they were not racists, or at least don't see themselves as racist or weren't driven by race. Some of these people were Obama voters who switched to Trump. So I'm not sure that race was the overriding factor, but it could have also been an underlying one. I think that it's an incredibly complicated story that was not captured in real time, but I think there are a lot of reasons why, and I don't think it falls easily in the press just didn't get it, because I don't think that's true. I think we had a lot of conversations at the Times, particularly, about how to cover this.
In the campaigns, the Trump campaign particularly, there was very little reference and background on who was giving him advice and how they were giving it and from whence they came. And one would have valued that very early as he started to emerge.
I think is the question why we didn't do more of that. So we actually did do a fair amount of it early on. His circle was pretty small at that point. It was basically him and 3 aides on his plane, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who played an increasingly important role in the campaign. Steve Bannon, his chief strategist who ran Breitbart, was always sort of whispering in his ear. Trump, he said recently, and I forget where he said it, but he said that, he said it at this tech meeting that he had at his office. We don't have a real organizational chart. And it's really a truer words never spoken thing. He gets input from like 200 different people, and you never quite are able to pinpoint exactly who he is hearing from. It is a tremendous challenge to cover him. It is a tremendous challenge to figure out exactly what input he is responding to. So I agree that there is more that needs to be done on that front, but just please bear in mind that this is a unique situation. Sure. I mean, on donors, look, I mean, he's very, very wowed by success, as you know, and he's very wowed by people who he perceives as doing, better than he is. But most of the donor class did not support him. One important person who did support him on this front, to your question, is Peter Thiel, who helped fund the lawsuit that closed Gawker. He is surrounded by a lot of very wealthy people who have a lot of his same impulses. And I think that's going to be an important storyline going forward, too.
Thank you, Maggie and Clyde.
Thank you.